Hello, this is Mark Tooley, editor of Providence, a journal of Christianity and American foreign policy, with another episode of Marksism, the good kind of Marxism, featuring the three editors of Providence, all of whom are named Mark, two of whom are with us today, myself and Marc LiVecche, broadcasting from Oxford, England. And we're going to start off by discussing a review that we posted this week about Dominion, a new history by British historian Tom Holland, whose thesis is contrary to how many conservative American Christians view history and current society. The thesis is that Christianity is triumphing around the world, in that the premise of human equality is now the conventional wisdom in virtually every culture, although every society, of course, falls short of its ideals, and also Christian ideas about cruelty and compassion have largely prevailed in every society and culture, although every society and culture continues to fall short. And I think Tom Holland, from viewing his recent tweets, finds vindication in the protests taking place in America, in Britain, and in other countries on issues of racial equality and injustice, and especially with the iconoclasm of tearing down statues, which Tom Holland notes, for better or for worse, has a long history within Christianity, especially its moments of zealotry when it tends to go after, quote unquote, the idols of their day. So Marc LiVecche, tell us what your views are on Tom Holland's Dominion.
Yeah, unfortunately I've only my primary exposure is through Dan's essay, which he's an able guide, so that's helpful. But I do have it on my Kindle and it's on my reading list. I've listened to a couple interviews with Holland, most notably a conversation that he did with N.T. Wright on a video series called Unbelievable, I think, where they talk about Paul and the influence of Paul on the Western world. I think Holland's critique is great. I think a part of the real value of it is his noting that it's because Christianity has so thoroughly saturated the Western mind that we almost have the luxury to not pay attention to that fact, to take for granted that everybody believes in human rights in the same way, everybody believes in human dignity in the same way, and so we still breathe Christianized air. And we're still standing in a largely, Hebraically infused moral atmosphere, and we don't even know it. So I think that's the value of what he's pointing out. And I think that's the strength of the Western world. I also like, in a despairing sort of way, his critique of the Western world, which is to wonder aloud what happens when we still have the Christian ideas, but we've deracinated ourselves, we've uprooted ourselves from a Christian grounding. What happens when a culture holds on to certain ideas but no longer has a basis for them? And I think when you look in the streets, you see what happens to a culture when it's forgotten its Hebraic grounding.
Like you, I'm still reading Tom Holland's book, but read many of the reviews, and Holland seems a little bit agnostic on this point that you raise. Can the Christian ethic continue to prevail without the faith and the orthodox doctrines of Christianity? And it's not clear exactly where Holland himself stands spiritually. He seems to have become a convert to the idea of Christianity, if not to Christ himself.
Correct.
So maybe you and I both need to read the final chapter before we can make a final assessment. But the critique of Holland would be, and I think that your friend Matthew Rose makes this in his review in First Things magazine, that it's almost a social gospel perspective, in that it focuses on the Christian ethic without the Christian doctrine. And can that ethic prevail without the doctrine? But where do you come down on that, Mark?
Yeah, I'm skeptical if it can hold for long. There's the great Yeats poem about the falcon circling the falconer, and as he gets further and further from the falconer, eventually the falcon can no longer hear its calls, So it knows its origin, it knows where it's come from, and for a while it can appropriately orbit the source of its founding. But eventually, as Yeats says, the falcon gets further away and the center cannot hold. And so I think you see that playing out. I think in the streets, there's this, for instance, there's the demand for justice for George Floyd. And justice is great, and justice is warranted, especially in that situation. But you look at that situation and you're left wondering, what will justice look like for some of the people that are demanding it? Because as I see it, first of all, just procedurally, justice seems to be plodding along. Appropriate people have been arrested. Charges are being vetted. A case will be held and judgments made and punishments forthcoming. So what do they mean by justice? What do they mean by human dignity? The interview that I did with Derek Green this week contrasts a Christian anthropology with a racial anthropology. Everybody in that conversation, the advocates of the racial anthropology or the advocates of the Christian anthropology, they all recognize human dignity, but it's going to be grounded in something very different. And if human dignity is an idea that if it's been tacitly held by cultures throughout history, it is best articulated in Hebraic culture. But once it's articulated, if we forget the Hebraic grounding, then you end up recognizing that there's dignity, but not being really sure what it's grounded in. Maybe alighting on something like race or difference, or sexual orientation, or religious point of view, or whatever it happens to be. So you've still got dignity, but it's no longer grounded in the right things. And eventually it begins to clash with other views of dignity. And you have some of the, I think, the chaos that you're seeing in the streets. So like Matthew Rose, I'm skeptical. I think if we lose the foundation, then eventually things will fall away.
Now, you're a scholar of the Holocaust, obviously the greatest crime of our modern era. Is there anything instructive there in terms of how the Jewish people now look at Germany? My impression would be the mainstream Jewish attitude is we never, never, never forget, but we're not going to hold as responsible the grandchildren of those who performed these crimes 80 years ago, and we're not going to obsess over those crimes in a way that inhibits our progress. But maybe you can summarize it much better than I can.
No, I think that's right. I think there would be a Hebraic understanding that God holds people to account for the sins that they have committed. You can't hold forthcoming generations responsible for things that they themselves did not do. However, they might have, some sort of continued complicity, a denial of their history, a denial of the past. Then you address those issues. But the invention of the individual in many ways began, in the Hebraic mind, where all of a sudden the individual matters, not independent, not isolated from everyone else. But we're C.S. Lewis said it, that Christianity recognizes that believers are called to be sheep in a fold, not drips in a pool. We're not just glommed together. We're individuals. We're held individually responsible for the things that we do. And if there are systemic injustices, you address them. But I think the Jewish attitude toward Nazi Germany has been a good model going forward. So I think that's right.
Shifting topics, I interviewed Colin Dueck regarding his article for American Enterprise Institute on what he calls the new traditionalist thinkers who are very familiar to, I think, to most readers of Providence. Yoram Hazony, the Israeli thinker, Patrick Deneen at Notre Dame University. Who am I forgetting? Rusty Reno, editor of First Things magazine.
George Will, I think he talks about, right?
Well, George Will is kind of a counterpoint. He's the old traditionalist. The new traditionalists also include the blogger in Louisiana who writes the apocalyptic books.
If you didn't ask me that, I would have been able to say his name.
You know who I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Well, there are 5 of these, and also the New York Times columnist Ross Douthat. So these 5 traditionalists whom Colin Dueck provides an overview of are united by their skepticism of an older conservatism that was internationalist and reflexively pro-free market, pro-free trade, maybe not as concerned about cultural issues and social conservatism. And so Dueck contrasts these new traditionalists with George Will, and he portrays sort of the embodiment of the older conservatism, which was much more classically liberal. Many of the new traditionalists are even hostile to America's founding, but not all of them. I neglected to ask Colin, even though he is a scholar of international affairs, the foreign policy implications of the new traditionalists, which obviously is very important to us. But what is your assessment of these new traditionalists? Are they correct, first of all, in their perspective? Secondly, is their influence growing? Is this the new voice of conservatism in America, or is this a passing phase?
Yeah, I still like the Holland book. I still need to read the final chapter on that story before I think I can pass adequate judgment. I think it's a fascinating question. I think if there's a analog in Robert George's review of the Supreme Court case with Neil Gorsuch, he saw the whole ruling as a signal of the loss or an attack against the rule of law. And Sohrab Ahmari quoted something or tweeted something to the effect of, Robert George is coming around, suggesting that there's something to this idea that liberalism has run its course, and that there's a recognition that on the other side, at least, they liberalism works when everybody plays by the rules, and if not everybody's playing by the rules, and maybe you need to get a different set of rules or play the different game. So I think that critique is going to increase. I think there's a recognition that there's a recognition that we're not necessarily facing, say it this way, that the other side in certain cases is not interested in playing fair. A lot of the progressives simply seem to want to run conservatives out of the public square altogether. And if that's the case, then a lot of the old way of doing things isn't going to work because we're going to be pushed out. So I think the critique, if that's a part of it, is going to exacerbate. I think you see it in the streets now, where we can have the conversation of, well, some of the statues, for instance, should come down. If they're Confederate generals and traitors to the nation, tear those statues down. But other statues of people who might have held slaves, but they were by and large good people, so George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, those should stay. That seems like an easy thing to be able to say, but just in Oregon today, they took down George Washington. Thomas Jefferson came down somewhere yesterday, I think. So I think conservative strategy, at least, is going to have to take a very different tact as the situation on the ground continues to unfold. So personally, I don't know what to think. I listened to, the old David French, Sohrab Ahmari debate, and there's value on both sides. What do you think? Help me out.
Well, I saw where Sohrab Ahmari today tweeted out that there needed to be a crackdown against the protests, as he's a native of Iran, of course. So he's saying there should be a crackdown, just as the Shah should have cracked down against the Islamist protests before he was overthrown. I thought that kind of rhetoric was a little bit overblown and not particularly helpful in our American context. I don't think that we're the equivalent of revolutionary Iran in 1979. So that kind of polarizing rhetoric, I don't think is helpful for conservatives of any stripe.
No, there's two ways to fall off a horse, right? He sounds like he went off the other side.
Have you personally witnessed any statue activity there in Oxford?
I haven't seen anything come down, but I think I mentioned last week, I went to the protest against Rhodes, where they wanted him to come down.
And he is coming down, is that correct?
But so I've heard two things. I don't know what the final verdict is. Maybe you know more than I do. I've heard that Oral College has voted, the faculty has voted that he should come down. But I've also heard a sort of a counter to that was a safe thing for them to do. It might have been an honest thing. I'm not saying it was purely political, but that apparently some of the money behind the college isn't going to agree to it. So the faculty was able to have sort of a face-saving vote that, oh, yes, solidarity should come down.
Statement was made.
It's never going to happen. But I don't know. What do I know?
Now, your colleague there at Oxford, Nigel Bigger, if I recall correctly, has editorialized against pulling Cecil Rhodes down. What are his talking points, if you recall?
I don't recall. We should point to the article in the program notes. My assumption is I mean, talking to Nigel would be the erasure of history is generally never a good idea. You know, that like George Washington, like Thomas Jefferson, there were some things that they did that were wrong and sinful. And then there was a lot of things that they did that weren't wrong or sinful, products of their time, you know, men who in their own age achieved extraordinary things. So an admixture of good and bad, like all of us. And that, you know, if there aren't glaring evils, you know, then grace and humility should probably rule the day. And, you know, we honor the parts of their memory that are honorable, and we discuss and we condemn the bits that aren't. But tearing the statue down, I think in Rhodes' case, I think Nigel would say that there's enough in him as a human being to laud. You know, a lot of the attacks against Rhodes are attacks against the empire and the idea of empire. And Nigel, of course, has famously gotten into debates about, you know, whether or not the empire was unmitigated evil, or if actually it might have done some good. And, you know, these are highly unpopular questions to ask, especially when you come down and say, oh yeah, I think there were some good things. So he would take a nuanced approach to it, and nuance is not very sexy anymore.
It's not, and I've often wondered if our public spaces shouldn't, in some sense, resemble some of Europe's great national cathedrals, which include, as they reflect what's happened with those cathedrals across the centuries, both great saints and great sinners. Both are portrayed in the art and the statuary, and I think they just think that that's a portrayal of human life under the providence of God, and the saints and the sinners merit our recognition and the lessons they teach us.
No, I think that's right. I think, I loved your essay on that. And I think, you know, you walk around some of the cemeteries, I've seen this in America, but you walk around a lot of the cemeteries in Europe and you'll see a sign on the cemetery gate that reminds the living viewer that as you are, we were, the dead speaking, and as we are, you will be, right? And this constant reminder that, you know, you're going to die. And in that same spirit, I think these reminders that there are things, as, you know, again, to gesture to C.S. Lewis, there are things about being human beings that, you know, should make us hold our heads up high. And there are things about being a human being that ought to make us hang our head in shame. And we forget both those things at our peril. And we don't celebrate the one, but it seems reasonable to remember it. I would never want Auschwitz, the grounds of Auschwitz, to be bulldozed over and for, you know, green space or condominiums to be built up. I want that hellish piece of earth to always be there. So we remember not to think too highly of ourselves. Doesn't seem so wrong.
And yet we would never tolerate statues for major figures from the Third Reich. But on the other hand, as there was in, I believe, Belgium recently, an attack on a statue of Julius Caesar, who had his own share of crimes by our definition in his time. So do you have any clear formula in terms of how we make these decisions? Yes to Caesar, but no to anyone from the Third Reich.
Right. I don't. I think you used to be able to prevail to common sense, but there is nothing common about anybody's sense of anything anymore. Paul Miller, one of our frequent contributors, tweeted that the Confederate statue's down, but George Washington up. And you go through his feed, and there's lots of people who are pushing back against that. So if George Washington isn't safe, then I don't know what the formula would be. At what point does the scale tip one direction or another? There are certain things that you can't not know. And if you saw a picture of Reinhold Heydrich in a village square, you would just sort of intuitively know that this does not belong there, unless he's, being hanged or something. And if you don't sort of get that, this goes back to where we started with Christian foundationalism. If you don't have a basic foundation for thinking things through, then some of those self-evident issues in life aren't going to be self-evident anymore. What are human rights? When they put together the Declaration of Human Rights, they got an awful lot of them correct. But nowadays you start seeing some of the lists of human rights, and a 2-week paid vacation is in the list, right? The Falcon is flying away. So,
well, on that note about the Falcon, Marc LiVecche, thank you for this episode of Marksism. Until
thank you, Mark.
Next week.